If you spend your days inside a modern organization, you are likely intimately familiar with a specific kind of low-grade existential dread. It's the feeling of sitting through a performance review where your entire year of human effort is compressed into a 1-to-5 rating scale. It's the absurdity of writing a self-evaluation using rigid corporate jargon that sounds like it was written by artificial intelligence. It's the quiet panic of watching your calendar fill up with mandatory meetings designed to discuss why productivity metrics are dipping, leaving you with zero actual time to do the work you were hired for. We are conditioned to treat these realities as minor annoyances, or perhaps the fault of incompetent leadership. We tell ourselves that if we just find a better company or a more empathetic manager, the alienation will fade. But that is a profound misunderstanding of the world we live in. The structural misery, the sterile anxiety, and the profound hollowing out of meaning in the contemporary workplace are not accidental glitches. They are the systemic, logical, and highly predictable outcomes of a centuries-old project. To understand how we became trapped, we must first disentangle two terms that are frequently conflated: modernism and the Modernist Project. Modernism, properly understood, is a cultural and artistic phenomenon. It is the frantic, brilliant, and often fractured response to a rapidly changing world. It is found in the dissonant chords of Igor Stravinsky, the fragmented poetry of T.S. Eliot, or the cubist perspectives of Pablo Picasso. Modernism looked at a destabilized world and sought to express its chaotic humanity. But the Modernist Project is an entirely different beast. It is the overarching socio-political, philosophical, and economic campaign that began during the Enlightenment. Its core mission was not to express chaos, but to eradicate it. It was a grand, hyper-optimistic attempt to apply human reason, scientific empirical investigation, and engineering principles to every single facet of human life, from the structure of our governments to the design of our cities, down to the very thoughts inside our heads. The driving conviction of this project was that the old ways of living, rooted in tradition, religious faith, local customs, and unmeasured intuition, were fundamentally inadequate for a complex, evolving world. The Modernist Project promised that through absolute rationality, humanity could achieve total mastery over nature and a complete social utopia. But buried inside this utopian blueprint was a fatal ontological flaw. To engineer a perfect society, you must treat society like a machine. And to make a machine run flawlessly, the human beings inside it must be stripped of their messy, unpredictable spontaneity. They must be standardized. This is part one of the story. We are going to trace the philosophical and practical architects of this project. We will look at exactly how they argued, how their theories jumped from dusty books into concrete and steel, and how they systematically constructed the invisible bars of the organizational cage you sit in today. To build a trap this total, you first have to change how humanity understands reality itself. You have to alter ontology, our definition of what is real, and epistemology, our definition of how we know truth and what the nature of knowledge is. Before the 17th century, the human place in the universe was deeply interconnected, narrative, and spiritual. Truth was anchored in tradition, localized folklore, and cosmic mystery. But the philosophical architects of the Enlightenment shattered this framework. They argued that if humanity was ever to progress, the old ways of thinking had to be aggressively dismantled. The first major structural pillar was laid by English philosopher and scientist Francis Bacon in the early 1600s. Bacon pioneered the empirical scientific method. He famously argued that knowledge is not a passive contemplation of divine truth, but an instrument of power. He wrote that nature must be bound into service and forced to yield her secrets for the material improvement of the human condition. Think about the phrase, nature must be bound into service. In the modern workplace, this is the philosophical justification for treating you as a natural resource. You are not a whole human being. You are human resources. Your energy, your focus, and your time are variables to be extracted, mined, and bound into the service of the organizational output. Shortly after Bacon, the French philosopher René Descartes provided the project with a definitive mathematical blueprint. Descartes was obsessed with absolute certainty. To achieve it, he enacted a radical mental split. He separated the mind, the thinking, rational self, from the body and the physical world, which he viewed as mere matter in motion. This is the famous Cartesian dualism. To Descartes, the universe was not a living, sacred organism. It was a giant mechanical clockwork device governed by mathematical laws. When Descartes reduced the physical world to a machine, he opened the door to viewing human organizations as machines as well. If your company's executive leadership treats the business like an engine, where you pull a lever at the top and a predictable result must come out the bottom, you are living in Descartes' clockwork universe. The Cartesian mindset is exactly why your company believes it can reorganize entire departments overnight on a slide deck, completely ignoring the fragile, non-mechanical human relationships that actually hold the workplace together. By the late 1600s, English philosopher John Locke took this mechanical worldview and applied it directly to human nature and governance. Locke argued that the human mind at birth is a tabula rasa, a blank slate. He posited that human beings are shaped entirely by their environment, inputs, and institutional conditioning. Furthermore, he defined society as a rational contract built to protect property and maximize material utility. Finally, he believed in the empirical basis of human knowledge. Under Locke's view, people became highly malleable units. If human beings are blank slates, then they can be engineered, trained, and reprogrammed to fit the needs of any administrative apparatus. This is the exact philosophical birth of modern corporate onboarding, behavioral compliance training, and the terrifying idea that an employee can be completely reshaped to match a company's core values. In the late 1700s, this entire philosophical lineage was brought to its spectacular, triumphant peak by the Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant. To understand how Kant supercharged the Modernist Project, we have to look at his revolutionary understanding of the human mind. Before Kant, philosophers argued about whether knowledge came from sensory experience or pure reason. Kant staged what he called a Copernican revolution in philosophy. He argued that the human mind is not a passive receiver of reality. Instead, the mind actively constructs our experience of reality. According to Kant, the world out there, the noumenon, is inherently chaotic and unknowable. We can only know the world as it appears to us, the phenomenon. And it only appears to us because our minds possess hardwired, internal cognitive structures, like the categories of time, space, and causality, that slice, dice, filter, and organize that chaos into a neat, predictable experience. Do you see what Kant did? He established that the ultimate power of the human mind is its ability to impose categorical order onto chaos. Kant then took this epistemology and applied it to history and ethics. In his famous 1784 essay, What is Enlightenment?, he defined the era as humanity's emergence from its self-incurred immaturity, our liberation from relying on the dogmas of priests or kings. He gave the Modernist Project its grand teleological orientation. He posited a telos, an ultimate driving destination where history is a grand linear march toward perfect rationality, universal moral laws, and absolute human freedom. For Kant, progress was a duty. The old ways of creating, believing, and living were no longer adequate for a rapidly changing world. They had to be subjected to the critical tribunal of pure reason. This was a deeply utopian ambition. The Enlightenment promised that if we just stayed on the path of categorical ordering and rationality, we would eventually outgrow war, ignorance, and suffering. But here lies the dark, crushing irony of the Modernist Project. While its theoretical orientation was highly teleological, promising a glorious final destination of human freedom, our actual experience of it has been completely anti-teleological. The finish line of human liberation was completely replaced by a perpetual loop of optimization. The Enlightenment promised that we would use reason to free ourselves so that we could enjoy our lives. Instead, the means became the end. Modern organizations adopted Kant's concept that the highest function of intelligence is to impose rigid, categorical order onto chaos, and weaponized it. Your corporate HR department, your operations teams, your compliance officers, they are all acting as perverted Kantian minds. They look at the messy, chaotic, beautiful reality of human talent and human relationships, and they find it intolerable. So they force it through their rigid corporate categories, job architectures, performance bands, and competency matrices. We no longer optimize our workflows to buy ourselves leisure. We use our leisure to optimize ourselves for our workflows. We are trapped in an endless march of progress that has no final destination, only a demand for a 3% increase in efficiency next quarter. The ladder to freedom became an infinite corporate escalator. As the 19th century arrived, the abstract ideas of the philosophers were institutionalized. The Industrial Revolution required a massive scaling up of human organization, and the intellectual elite of the 1800s set out to seal the Modernist Project into the concrete structures of daily life. The project stopped being just an idea. It became an inescapable system. To provide this massive structural shift with an unstoppable sense of historical legitimacy, the project turned to the work of G.W.F. Hegel. Hegel adopted Kant's idea of historical progress and turned it into an absolute cosmological engine using his famous dialectic. Hegel argued that history does not move in a straight, peaceful line, but through a process of structural conflict and resolution. Every stage of history generates the dominant idea or state of being, the thesis. But the thesis inherently contains its own internal contradictions, which generate an opposing force, the antithesis. These two opposing forces clash in a violent, chaotic struggle, but that struggle is not meaningless. It eventually resolves into a higher, more evolved state of reality, the synthesis. The synthesis then becomes the new thesis, and the wheel turns again, climbing higher and higher. To Hegel, this dialectical process was the unfolding of Geist, the world spirit or cosmic reason, marching toward absolute self-actualization and freedom within a rational state. Crucially, Hegel argued that what is real is rational, and what is rational is real. He believed that history had a built-in momentum, and that modern institutions, like the centralized bureaucratic state, represented the highest, most evolved synthesis of human reason to date. By doing this, Hegel reinforced the dangerous cultural myth that we still suffer from today, the absolute myth of historical inevitability. Because Hegel framed the historical dialectic as an upward march of reason, the Modernist Project absorbed a terrifying justification. The present system is inherently superior to whatever came before, simply because it is the latest synthesis. In the modern workplace, this Hegelian ghost appears every single time a company introduces a sweeping, frustrating corporate restructuring or a new automated software platform that completely breaks your daily workflow. If you complain that the old way worked perfectly, that it was more human, and that it also allowed for organic collaboration, your objections are instantly dismissed as primitive. You are told you are resisting change or standing on the wrong side of progress. The new hyper-rationalized system doesn't need to prove it makes your life better. It justifies its own existence simply because it represents the next modern phase of organizational evolution. But notice the absolute tragedy of how this Hegelian dialectic actually plays out in modern corporate life. In Hegel's theory, the synthesis is supposed to preserve the best parts of the past while moving forward. but in the hands of the Modernist Project, the corporate dialectic acts as a meat grinder. Every time human spontaneity, the thesis, clashes with bureaucratic control, the antithesis, the corporate synthesis is never a beautiful balance. It is always a more total, more invasive, and more hyper-optimized layer of administrative surveillance. But while Hegel gave us a grand narrative, Jeremy Bentham gave us a practical, cold geometry of that control. Bentham was the father of utilitarianism, the ethical theory stating that society should be organized to produce the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, and that happiness could be mathematically calculated through utility. To realize this philosophy of total discipline and efficiency, Bentham designed a radical architectural structure, the panopticon. The panopticon was a circular jail with an inspection tower at the center. The inmates in the surrounding cells were backlit, meaning the supervisor in the tower could see every movement they made, but the inmates could never see into the tower. Because the prisoners never knew exactly when they were being watched, they had to assume they were being watched at all times. Bentham noted that this caused the inmates to internalize the gaze of the warden, policing their own behavior out of perpetual anxiety. Look around your current workplace. If you work in a modern, open-plan office with glass walls where your monitor is visible to anyone walking down the hall, you are sitting in a physical panopticon. If you work remotely, the panopticon has simply gone digital. It is the green active dot on your software applications. It is the employee monitoring software that tracks your mouse movements or takes random screenshots of your desktop. Bentham's dream has been perfectly realized in the modern white-collar world. You are under constant, invisible surveillance, forcing you to perform busyness and internalize the corporate gaze until you are policing your own thoughts. Even Karl Marx, the most fierce critic of 19th century industrial capitalism, was deeply trapped within the assumptions of the Modernist Project. Marx shared the Enlightenment's absolute faith in teleology and industrial progress. He believed that the massive factories and technological advancements of capitalism were a necessary, irrational historical stage that would eventually allow the working class to seize the means of production and engineer a workers' utopia. Because Marx bought into the modernist myth of industrial production as the primary site of human meaning, his philosophy failed to foresee a profound truth. Whether the factory or the office is owned by a capitalist billionaire or by a socialist state bureaucrat, the internal experience of being standardized, managed as a cog inside a hyper-rationalized system, is exactly the same brand of soul-crushing misery. By the turn of the 20th century, the Modernist Project stopped hiding behind philosophical abstractions. It found its practical executioners, people who looked at the human being and saw nothing more than a poorly optimized biological machine. The most influential of these practical architects was Frederick Winslow Taylor. In the early 1900s, Taylor invented scientific management, or Taylorism. He brought stopwatches, clipboards, and slide rules onto the factory floor. He took complex trades that craftsmen had spent lifetimes mastering and broke them down into tiny, brainless, repetitive gestures that could be timed down to the microsecond. Taylor explicitly argued that workers should not think. They should merely execute the one best way, designed by management. Taylorism is the absolute blueprint for the contemporary misery of the workplace. If you feel that your job has been completely drained of autonomy, you are experiencing Taylorism. It is the call center worker who is handed a rigid script and timed on how many seconds they spend on the phone with a grieving customer. It is the warehouse worker whose path through the building is calculated by an algorithmic stopwatch on their handheld scanner. It is the corporate consultant forced to build slide decks using standardized templates that strip away any creative expression. Taylor's ghost is the person who took the joy of craftsmanship and replaced it with a standardized operating procedure. While Taylor was optimizing the individual body, a French industrialist named Henri Fayol was busy optimizing the macrostructure of the organization. Fayol developed administrative theory giving us the foundational principles of corporate management we still suffer under today: the rigid scalar chain of command, the absolute unity of direction, the strict division of labor, and the departmentalization of skills into isolated silos. Fayol's work ensured that organizations would become highly centralized hierarchies, where information flows up into a bottleneck and commands flow down like a slow-moving river of lead. This rigid hierarchy is why modern organizations are so profoundly disconnected from reality. Employees on the front line see glaring problems every day, but because of Fayol's structural silos and chains of command, they have no agency to fix them. Instead, they must pass the information up through multiple layers of middle management, where it is sanitized, polished, and stripped of its urgency before it reaches an executive who is completely insulated from the actual work. Fayol's work also has important implications for over a century's worth of leadership theory and research, a topic for another video. Simultaneously, in the 1920s and 30s, a group of mathematicians and philosophers known as the Vienna Circle formulated a radical doctrine called logical positivism. They asserted a simple, brutal epistemological rule. The only statements that have any literal meaning are those that can be empirically verifiable or logically tautological. If something cannot be measured, weighed, or mathematically proven, it is dismissed as mere emotional noise. It is impossible to overstate how deeply logical positivism has infected contemporary corporate culture. Think about how this manifests when you try to voice your frustrations. If you tell an HR representative or a senior vice president, this restructuring is destroying our team's psychological safety, killing morale, and making us feel profoundly alienated, watch their eyes glaze over. The modernist organizational language has no room for the soul. The system immediately asks, "Can you quantify that? What are the data? Can we see that on a chart?" Because human dignity, creative exhaustion, and spiritual hollowing out cannot be captured by a metric, the logical positivist framework treats them as non-existent. If it can't be measured in a KPI, it doesn't matter. The ultimate triumph of the Modernist Project occurred when it broke out of the factory floor in the corporate headquarters and physically rewrote the landscape of the earth. The practical architects realized that to truly standardize humanity, they needed to build a physical world that enforced that standardization. This was the era of high modernism, and its standard bearer was the architectural avant-garde, the Bauhaus school in Germany, and the Swiss-French visionary architect Le Corbusier. Modernist architecture stripped away all historical ornamentation, local character, and organic complexity. It replaced them with concrete, glass, steel, and stark geometric functionalism. Le Corbusier looked at the messy, winding, historically rich streets of Paris and wanted to bulldoze them entirely, replacing them with massive, identical concrete towers set inside a rigid, bureaucratic grid. If a house is a machine for living in, then the city is a machine for working in, and an office is a machine for producing in. This architectural ideology created the physical world we inhabit today. The soul-crushing uniformity of suburban strip malls, the brutalist government complexes, and the endless rows of fluorescent-lit corporate cubicles. They designed spaces meant to optimize the flow of bodies and capital, completely ignoring the human psychological need for beauty, texture, and organic community. The German sociologist Georg Simmel watched this spatial transformation happen in real time and documented its psychological toll. Simmel admired the scale of the modern metropolis, but warned that its hyper-calculated, hyper-rationalized environment forces human beings to develop a psychological shield. To survive the overwhelming stimulation of the cold, transactional nature of a planned city, humans adopt what he called the blasé attitude, a state of emotional detachment, calculated indifference, and deep cynicism. Does that blasé attitude sound familiar? It is the exact emotional armor you have to put on every morning just to set foot inside your workplace. It is the numbness you cultivate to endure the corporate buzzwords, the superficial social media posts, and the transactional relationships where everyone is just networking to exploit someone else for career advancement. Simmel realized that the modernist landscape forces us to become cold and calculating just to survive it. The German sociologist Karl Mannheim expanded on this, warning about the dangers of total social planning under the modernist umbrella. Mannheim distinguished between functional rationality, where everything is organized for maximum efficiency, and substantial rationality, which is the capacity to think deeply, ethically, and independently. He warned that as the Modernist Project expanded its planning apparatus, functional rationality would completely destroy substantial rationality. You may note here that the functional rationality is similar to the Frankfurt School's instrumental rationality. People would become so specialized, so buried under administrative rules and planned systems, that they would lose their ability to ask, is what we are doing actually good? Is it meaningful? They would simply follow the process, turning into bureaucratic functionaries incapable of moral judgment. And this is precisely why the Modernist Project feels like a trap. There is no outside. You leave a home designed as a machine, commute down a highway designed as a machine, to sit in a cubicle designed as a machine, performing tasks optimized by a stopwatch for an organization that only recognizes your value if it can be turned into a spreadsheet metric. The contemporary misery of organizations is not a mistake. It is the linear historical culmination of the timeline we have just walked through. We are living inside a cage that took 400 years to build. Bacon gave us the mandate for ruthless extraction. Descartes gave us the mechanical worldview. Locke gave us the malleable, programmable human unit. Immanuel Kant gave us an insatiable, endless strive for progress without a final destination, while his categories were weaponized to box in our souls. Hegel convinced us that this was all historically inevitable, while his dialectic ground away our spontaneity. Bentham gave us the panopticon of constant surveillance. Taylor and Fayol turned our bodies and hierarchies into optimized clockwork. The Vienna Circle erased our emotional and spiritual vocabulary, and Corbusier and the high modernist planners sealed us into concrete and steel. We have built a world that is completely rational, completely ordered, and completely miserable. We have optimized everything except the human soul. But a question remains. If this project has spent centuries creating such profound alienation, why didn't we stop it? How did it manage to run over every defense mechanism of human culture? Why were the philosophers, the artists, and the ordinary workers who screamed warnings along the way systematically ignored, silenced, or absorbed into the machine?